What's going on, everybody? Welcome into The Highlight, a business podcast for business people, a show all about shining the spotlight on other entrepreneurs and business leaders in the community, growing businesses, making the world a better place. And today, I'm really excited about this. I'm a little scared, if I'm being honest, because I have the co-founder of the Sage Executive Group, Jerry Rollins here. And Jerry, I'm about to mess your name up because when I was reading your book, I was reading about the enforcer to entrepreneur, and like the enforcer side got me. I'm trying not to mess this up today. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah. There's a lot of E's and R's in there. Entrepreneur is very difficult to spell as well.
Yeah. Until I became one, I don't think I knew how to spell it, but
Yeah.
now we're here. Jerry, I got to know, give us a quick background. How does one go from being an enforcer and become an entrepreneur?
Sure. Well, like most people in Canada, I grew up in Canada. I was born and raised there most of my life, and my father played in the NHL and was very accomplished in that. And then he went into coaching. So, like many Canadians with professional athletes in their family, I followed in his footsteps, just on a different path. He was a highly skilled player, and I was an enforcer, which means the one that drops the gloves back in the day. And I was played during an era when penalty minutes were a badge of honor as compared to now. So
Mm.
um, that's how I earned a living for many years in major, junior, and then in the professional ranks.
I
Um,
do remember reading in the book that you were one of your years were gifted or honored with most penalty minutes
yeah,
served.
it's not a gift or an honor. It's dishonor, but it puts you in the hall of shame, not fame. So yeah, I was the most penalized player in hockey in 1975. So before almost all of your listeners were born, I was the most penalized player in hockey and had about 100 fights. So not something I look back on fondly now, but it was fun at the time and past the time.
Oh my goodness. Well. How did you go from professional hockey player to business owner? And I know
Sure.
in the book you talk about several exits you had and over the last couple decades. I'd love to hear that transition as
Sure.
well.
So, in the era that I played hockey, they wanted you to play hockey full time and not go to school. So most of us dropped out of high school back in those days. And, luckily I earned a professional living as a professional. Many players didn't, but went to the pro ranks, made the major leagues my first year. And after my playing career, with no education and no discernible skills other than knowing how to beat people up, I went into a natural career path, which was sales. So the good news is I knew enough about coaching and learning and training that I picked my first job. I picked a great company with great mentors. And so that was my formative years. And I went from entry level sales to general manager. We built a company and sold it. Um, I didn't have equity in the company, but I got an education there. So that was the benefit. Post that company, after it sold, I didn't want to join the large entity that bought us. I didn't want to be a president or a number in a big giant company. So my next four businesses, I became a hired gun for equity. So I would join a company when the revenues were in the 1 to 10 million revenue range, grow them with an exit in mind for a percentage of equity. So did that for 20 years after that, and had three successful exits. Another company that was merged, and fast forward to a lot of lessons I learned through those years building companies. Going from 10 employees to 1,000 at some point, and you learn a lot through practical application. But I learned even more when I was in my early 30s. I became CEO of my first company, and I recognized I really didn't know what I was doing. So, you have that, everybody has self-doubt. Well, mine was very, very clear. I have no education, I have no business background other than sales. I need to join a peer group. So I did, and luckily it was just like joining my first company, it was a great group of people, and I learned a lot there. And
Mm.
so that helped me through my formative years of building, buying, and selling companies through all the transactions I did. And then married 46 years. At the time, it was 36 years, 10 years ago.
Wow.
And I knew I was able to retire, but I didn't want to because don't have any children. I'm kind of hyperactive. I've always been around teams, so I missed the interaction of a team and leading and growing people. So I went out to my network and said, I'm starting this group called Sage, and had 30 some members within 90 days. And that was the start of it. So fast forward to today, we have about 100 members all across the nation, from key executive all the way up to CEO, companies from 1 million all the way to 3 billion in revenue that we work with on a monthly basis. So that fulfills my time. Just keeps me busy enough, but not too busy.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I definitely want to get into the book here that you
uh-huh.
wrote as well, Enforcer to Entrepreneur, and I got to tell you, as a early 30s co-founder myself, it gives me a lot of hope to see guys like you coming back and giving more wisdom to the early guys like me that they got a lot of lumps left to live. And what I'm getting out of this book when I read it was that if I take Jerry's lessons and I apply them to my life, I won't have to repeat the same mistakes, and maybe I can avoid some of the business penalty minutes, so to speak. Here, that was I don't think we've talked about this before, but I've talked about it on the podcast that my first business was a barbecue restaurant, and
Yeah.
that we actually grew and we got it over $1 million, and it was a very fun thing. Had 25 employees at its peak, and we were on a reality TV show and did all these fun things, and then I crashed it. And I crashed it because I didn't have, people like you. I was not involved in any sort of mentor networking groups like that. And I think looking back now, had I been able to plug into something like that at that time, I could have avoided a lot of the big, risky, overly risky, stupid decisions I made at the end there. So do you think, I mean, it sounds like at least that the experience you had in your early 30s is sort of the core of what drove you to build Sage. Is that right?
Yeah, it's you know, although I would say early in my career I was not coachable. I couldn't take advice or direction from anyone, and so I made a lot of mistakes. After I joined my first peer group and I started listening to smarter people in the room, I really learned a lot, and I avoided many of the big issues, bankruptcies and crashing companies and all of those, things that we want to avoid. I learned through others that had done all of those things before. So I kind of threw away what I'd learned up until that point and said, from this point forward, whenever I'm going to do something, I'm going to find out who the best people in the field are. I'm going to go and get to know them, hang out
Mm-hmm.
with them. And, when you hang out with smart people, some of it even rubs off on me. So it's, I'm an example of someone who, with, a good work ethic and moderate intelligence, can do just great in life if you are able to be coachable. Yeah.
Mm. Have you heard Patrick Lencioni's framework, The Hungry, Humble, Smart? I love that. When I read that book and I saw those three characteristics, I was like, wow. It's one of those books you read and you're like, I wish I had this 5, 6, 7 years ago because I could have avoided so many pain points. But it does sound like what you're describing there is be hungry, be humble, be smart, and that's essentially what's a coachable person, because you can
Yeah.
actually change and admit your faults and do all the things. So I got to know, there's a couple things in the book. I told you before we got on here that I have written down way too many questions for the time we have allotted. So
Sure.
we'll see what we could do here. But the one of the things that made me laugh literally out loud, people do the LOL thing, but this was literally, I almost spit my coffee out as I was going through this, was the SOS calls that you get from business owners that you work with. And it was the shit oh shit calls. And
Yep.
I got to know, like, A, where did that come from? And B, what are some of those like calls that sort of stick out to you as you reflect back and maybe as you were writing the book?
Yeah. So as I tell people today, at my advanced age of 67, soon to be 68, there's almost not a story I haven't heard
Mm,
multiple times before. So not much shakes me, surprises me. The calls I used to get 20, 30 years ago, I was like, oh my God, I've never heard of that before. Well, I've heard every one of them, 3 or 4 times now. So I think business is pattern recognition. People that are smart, if you can recognize patterns and you can remember when they occur, if you can file them away. I'm also a voracious note keeper. So whether, I keep all my notes, back in the day, it used to be in journals, right? And I still have those journals. For the last 15 years, it's electronically and it's searchable, which is great. You can go in and search anything, anytime. And with, artificial intelligence now, you can almost recreate what occurred many years ago. So I find that by taking notes, remembering those patterns, there's almost no situation, but I still get surprised every once in a while. So I've gotten calls with, these are true stories. I've just gotten a bomb threat. What do I do? Swear, in our business, I got a bomb threat. We've got 1,000 employees or no, 500 employees in the building. What do I do? Right? How do you
Jeez.
react? What do you do? Do you take it seriously? Is it a competitor playing with you? A disgruntled employee? I've gotten calls with uh, partnership breakups, family breakups, disasters, chemical spills. I mean, you name it, I have gotten the call. And it's almost now that when I get one, it's like, okay, now I've heard this 300 times. This person just heard it for the first time, but I've heard it for
Mhm.
300 times. So the first thing is, okay, you're going through this situation. If you didn't have me to call, what would you be doing right now? What would you do?
Mhm.
So I don't help people make decisions. I help them think and make
Mhm.
their own decisions. So I don't make decisions. I'm not the almighty. I don't tell people what to do. I think people need to be guided along a thought path. Like, what are two or three options you've thought of? How can I assist you in any of those two or three options? And then, we go from there. So often the person has the solution. They're just not thinking properly. And I'm the first person they dial when they have the challenge.
Yeah.
Because I'm on the, when you have a problem, give me a shout. So I get a
Yeah.
lot of those calls with,
I'm gonna put your name down as like one of the notes. There is the SOS button to hit
yeah,
when something happens. The craziest thing that ever happened to us was one time we had a disgruntled employee that was unfortunately addicted to drugs. In the restaurant business, you get a certain type of employee sometimes, and we didn't know it at the time. He hit it really well, but the guy ended up getting let go because we found out that he was high on the job. And he didn't like that. So he went down to the gas station. He took something, came back, said, "Hey, I'm here to get my last check." And we were trying to explain to him, that's not how we do it, da da da. And he was like, "All right, well, I'm going to go to the bathroom." He goes into the bathroom, locks himself in there, clogs up the toilet itself, the sink, the drain in the floor, because restaurants have drainage everywhere, and then turns all the water on, flushes the toilet, clogs it, and then leaves out the back door there because he used to work there, so he knew all the pathways. And then maybe 5 6 minutes later, a customer comes up to me and goes, "Hey, do you know your bathroom is flooding?" And I go back there and I'm like, "Oh, the fight or flight thing kicks in where you're like, oh crap, what do I do?" I didn't have Jerry's phone number at the time. I couldn't have called you. So we just but you don't, when you get into business and you start it, you don't ever think about, this is the crap I'm going to have to deal with. I don't think they teach that in business school necessarily. I don't think
no,
it ends up coming up in a lot of entrepreneur books. So that's what I really appreciated about your book. I mean, you can see behind me, I love to read, and this does not get brought up a lot. Do you
no.
think that the power of a network, like having people in your network and in your corner that you can call to help you think through things, because yeah, you're not going to know what the right decision is, but at least you ask the right questions to get them in the right set of mind. Is that really what the value of a network is to you, do you think?
And I think it's Lencioni that said the five people you hang around with the most
Hmm.
are
Yeah.
how smart you become. It's your community is everything. And so
Mhm.
again, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I learned it in sports. I
Mhm.
observed the greatest in sports and how hard they worked and how thoughtful they were, and the application of talent plus work ethic. And I learned the same thing in business. The smartest people I met were not the most educated, did not come from the best families. They were the ones that really worked at it. And then
Mhm.
they had their network that they drew from all the time. I learned that from them, is they had older, wiser people that advised them throughout the path. And too often what happens in business, if you're a 32-year-old CEO and you grew up and all of a sudden you're in business, well, you have your friends, your network of friends. But your network of friends, when I was a 32-year-old CEO, one was in the Navy and one was a plumber and one was, those are our friends, right? Well, then you learn that, hey, I need to hang out with people who are having the same challenges I am. So you've got to look for a different group of friends to hang out with, and they elevate you. And then what I made sure of I did all the time is I never discarded those people, but I always added new, bigger, better at different points in my career. So if, for example, when I was 30 million in revenue, I was hanging around with $100 million companies and $1 billion companies. When I got to 100 million in revenue, I started hanging out with billion and above to learn what I needed to know going forward. And I think it's the same in business. I think when you're in that sub 1 million, you need to hang out with people who are a million plus and then keep moving up your game. It's again, much like athletics. I went from playing kids hockey to organized to structured to major, junior, where you got paid, to professional. And even the professional levels, they had 3 or 4 different levels where you were, A, double A, triple A, and then the major leagues. And
Yeah.
every time you move up, you hang out with better, smarter people. So
Yeah,
that's your network.
I love that example, and it strikes home for me because I remember my first business when I had the wrong mentality. I was in my early 20s. I was a former Air Force guy, so you definitely shouldn't have called the Navy guy. That was a good idea on your part, if you want to know my opinion. But when I was in my early 20s and we started this business, I didn't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? And that's the thing you talk about at the end of the book when you start talking about getting into networks and building your sort of I would call a board of advisors kind of
Uh-huh.
thing, maybe of friends and peers that you can call, is you reference not being the smartest person in the room, and it's okay from an ego standpoint to not be the smartest person in the room, and it actually benefits you. I think you even said if you keep going to rooms that are bigger and bigger, and you think you're the smartest person there, you probably have a something's wrong in between the ears. There's
Yeah.
something going on there that you're not actually ready to go.
I've interviewed some CEOs through the years, and I can think of 2 or 3 that I interviewed that told me, they were interested in joining a group with me, but they went, my problem is I'm the smartest person in every room I went in or I've ever
Sure.
been in. Those people were delusional.
Hmm.
They weren't. And in most cases, if I followed them, A, I never did business with them because I don't like to work with delusional people. I like real and people who
Hmm.
are aware of both their strengths and their weaknesses, not who think they're the best at everything. Because those people typically fail at some point for some reason.
Yeah.
So, I think hanging out, knowing what you know, having confidence, but recognizing you can learn from everyone.
Yeah. Back to the hungry, humble, smart thing.
Yeah.
It's are you hungry? Are you humble? Are you smart? I don't remember where I heard this, but it was if you're truly a humble person, then you think in no matter the situation that the person you're talking to or looking at can teach you something. And I try to remember that in every situation that I'm in, and I've learned and heard some pretty interesting, crazy stories over the years just by asking people questions and then shutting up and
Yeah.
listening, and you can get somewhere in life, right?
Yeah. When you talk about humble, I think back to when you described that, and if I said it to my wife, she'd say the same name, Frank, a dear friend of mine. I joined my first peer group and I was 30 million.
Mm.
And I always had a feeling of inadequacy because all these folks went to Harvard and Yale and USC and Notre Dame in this room that I was in, other
Yeah.
than one guy. And this one guy barely got out of high school and went to a community college for a year, but he just happened to have the biggest company in the room.
Mm.
And at the time, it was about $1 billion private company. And he became a dear friend through the years. And we were really aligned because we kind of thought the same way. But I'll never forget one day they awarded, it was in Orange County, California, and they awarded they put in a magazine, the largest companies privately held in Orange County. And he was much bigger than any of them. And so I went to him and I said, Frank, that $700 million private company over there, you're $300 million bigger than them. Why aren't you in that magazine? And he said, best saying ever, whales only get harpooned when they rise to the surface.
Mm,
So what he
interesting.
was saying is he didn't want to be too public or visible because somebody would come after either his business, him personally, or
Mm,
in other ways. And that
yeah.
company sold last year at $3 billion to
Jeez.
Pilot Companies, which is a Tennessee company.
Hmm.
The family that is buying the Predators, the former governor, that's their family. They bought this business at $3 billion, and it was,
Wow.
an amazing company. And they always remained. If you met the CEO of that company today, who is 38 years old, who sold it, you wouldn't know he had $100 in his pocket. He's
Wow.
a humble guy. He was raised the same way as his father.
It's interesting. The marketer in me sort of is a little bit like, awareness for your business is a great idea. And that's what we do from a marketing standpoint is our job is to get you attention in the marketplace with the right customers so that you can grow your sales, right? But what you're describing is a more internal leader driven mindset, not a how we market the business mindset. He didn't want to be on
Absolutely.
that list because it was about ego. It wasn't about necessarily promoting and growing the business. And that was an interesting line. If he had been on the list, maybe he would have lost some customers, maybe lost employees. All of a sudden, the wrong people would have known more about his business than they necessarily needed to, and he could have cut himself off at the knees. So that's unique. So the next question has to be, I know we've both read Seven Habits of Highly Effective People by
Mhm.
Stephen Covey, and in that book he talks about begin with the end in mind. And you started your book with goal setting and sort of communication and all that stuff. And I'd love to know, what do you think, like, how do you set goals for business? And
Mhm.
then how do you actually communicate those goals to your team as the leader?
Sure.
Because I've worked for great organizations that do it really, really well. And I've done it okay at some points, and then I've done it really poorly at some points.
So I will tell you, when I start working with companies, I work with a lot of really successful companies, but some of them are newer, meaning sub 10 years. And
Mhm.
I'm always amazed at these very successful companies that don't have a plan. In other words, the CEO knows what the plan is, but you go to everybody else in the organization and say, tell me about the 5 year plan for this company or where you're going or your career path, and you hear crickets, right? So it's interesting that about even the ones that say they have a plan don't. And so the great teams I played on in sports had a playbook and they had a plan that they trained everybody to, and everybody knew what the plan was. The bad teams I played on had better talent, but failed because of a lack of a plan that was clearly described to the employees. So I'll tell you where there's a free tool for this is at my website. So it's free, they can download it. At my website, you go to my name, jerryrollins.com, JerryRollins.com, go to tools and go down to SWOT, SWOT, and business plan, number two, and you fill in the blanks. And then after you fill in the blanks, you communicate it to the team. And then you revise it on an annual basis and you live to that plan. And that plan has your vision, your values, your mission. All of it is in one place and it shouldn't occupy more than two pieces of paper.
Mm. Why do you think visionary entrepreneurs and leaders and CEOs don't want to go put pen to paper and make a plan a lot of times?
It becomes accountable. So CEOs are sometimes they don't want to be accountable to doing what they said they were going to do. So
Mm-hmm.
once you put it on a piece of paper, you got to go do it. Like, if you say, hey, we're going to go win the Super Bowl or the Stanley Cup or, you name it, you got to kind of do it because if you say it 2 or 3 years in a row, you're just a fraud, right?
Yeah.
So I think putting things in writing, whether it be a weight, the most famous one at this time of year is the weight goal. Everybody says in December, I'm going to lose weight next year. And, the difference between them and me would be, you know, let's say 10 years ago, I decided I was going to lose weight because I was way above my playing weight. I was living large. I'd gotten up to like 240. And so, you know what I did? I wrote it down on a piece of paper in my little paper journal. And then I did the things I was going to do to lose that weight. So I'm going to weigh every day. So I bought a scale and I put it in the room. And then I'm going to do these 2 or 3 things in terms of my diet and this one thing in terms of exercise. I wrote it down. And every day that I did those things, I checked them off. And I still do that today. So I have this watch on. Before I go to bed at night, I make sure I've done my 6 miles every day. And if I haven't done that, then I haven't fulfilled part of my fitness health goal, which if you're not fit and healthy, you can't get any of your other goals done. So I think accountability is when you write things down, you're accountable. And when you share it with other people, you're super accountable.
Yeah. As soon as it goes down on paper, you know exactly where you're missing the mark, which, again, there's a theme developing here, the hungry, humble, smart model, the lessening of the ego. It's okay to miss the mark. It's not okay not to hold yourself accountable and try. To hide is almost a coward's way out in the end of the day. I mean, it feels better, but that's sort of what a child might do. And so if we want to elevate as business owners or business leaders, we've got to change that. Another thing you talk about from a goal-setting planning perspective is to have the organization feed ideas from the bottom up and not come from the top down. I would love for you to unpack that if you would.
Sure, yeah. So when I was running the first time I became a president CEO, I think the company at the time was 7 million in revenue. And I knew where I wanted to go over the next, 9, 10 years. But I started, at the time we had about 50 employees. So I went to every employee in that company and found out what they liked about the company, what they didn't like, what we needed to do, who our customers needed to be. I went out and interviewed customers. I went and interviewed my 3 biggest competitors. 2 of them talked to me, and one of them told me to get out of his office. Now, the 2 that talked to me became lifelong friends, and as I built my company and surpassed theirs, we were still friends. The one that told me to leave his office, wouldn't talk to me, I ended up buying his company out of bankruptcy.
Wow.
5 years later. And at the time, he was the largest, and the other 2 were subservient to him. So I think it's important to do your research, but I believe, and then I'll give you the opposite result, which is, we sold our $117 million company to a $900 million company. And they had their business planning strategy, which was, 10,000 employees. The CEO decided what he was going to do and sent the plan out to everybody. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't real. And nobody believed it. Nobody bought into it. And I certainly didn't. As soon as my opportunity arose, I left that organization, as did every operating president within it, because it was a poorly run organization. So when you do top-down leadership, I believe you forget who does all the work and who really knows what's going on with the customers. So I believe in any company, survey your customers, survey your employees to find out what you need to be a better company.
Yeah, if you're coming at it from the ivory tower angle, it all sounds great and grand up here in our theoretical world where we're having these ideas. And when I was back to my first business, a lot of my decisions from a top-down perspective when I was making that mistake, I hope I've learned my lesson and I don't do it so much anymore. But back then it was really tied to, I need my idea to work out because it makes me feel good. It back to the ego thing. It serves my ego. It makes me feel better and look at me and how great of a leader I am now. And I'm the best entrepreneur that's ever sold barbecue. Like, that's never been done before. So it is an unhealthy place to be. And I feel much better now sitting in a room with people and back to the early thing we just talked about, which letting the other people in the room be smarter than you. We just brought on a third partner at the company, and the guy is a brilliant marketing technology guy, what's called MarTech. And it's all about how the different systems connect and talk to each other, and Google Analytics and all the coding and all the things. And that is so far outside of my core competency, and I love having him on the show and letting him shine and go do his thing. And I guess the reason I'm telling this story now is that for anybody that's struggling with this, it is so much more fulfilling to let somebody else go and take the reins. I don't know, as a the coach angle at least is always more fun. You talk about that in the
Absolutely.
book. The coaches and leaders or managers are very similar.
Hmm.
Why do you think that is? The best leaders at least.
It's interesting is I'll give you a statistic well, you know what? I'll take a shot, and I'll either verify or deny my. So take me back to high school. Were you in what did you do in high school? Tell me anything you were
Yeah.
involved in.
I was a baseball player.
Oh, really? That's
Hmm.
odd. So tell me about your partner, not the technology guy, but your other partner. What did that person do in high school?
I believe he was more into well, I have two partners. One partner was a rugby guy, and the other partner is a sort of like, video game, sort of
Yep.
that kind of thing is
Yeah.
what he was into.
So it doesn't matter. I'm not making this a sports analogy, but 99% of all the people I work with that are in leadership either played a high school sport, were on the high school newspaper, high school band was big,
Mm,
they're musicians, but they were involved with teams.
mm,
So all of those are team. If you're in high school yearbook, at least you're a collaboration of a team. You're used to a team. So you don't have to be an
mm.
athlete.
Yeah.
Although many of the CEOs I work with were high school athletes.
Hmm.
Um, I look at companies, there's companies now that I work with that every person in a key position in the company is a former athlete. Whether, I'm thinking of one right now, and one was the captain of a very successful national football program. And the other was a golfer in college, and the other was a soccer player. And so I look at that, just that competitive, team oriented leadership
Hmm.
role. I saw a picture of myself that I shared with a friend of mine's daughter the other day, a friend from when I was 14, 15, 16 years old. And I saw us standing next to each other as junior high school. And I had a captain's letter on my shirt, and he had the assistant captain. He was a leader at that age. He went into the restaurant business as we grew up. I went into sports and then business. But I can look back at the people who were leaders in junior high, high school were leaders many years later.
So when you were mentioning a earlier picture that you were sharing, I was really
Uh-huh.
hoping you were going to talk about page 16 in the book where you have that beautiful mullet from the
Flowing mullet. Yeah.
that thing, man. Whew, as a guy that's from South Georgia originally, it took me back to my childhood, man. I was like, I need that hair. We need
Yeah.
that back, man. We need to bring that back.
Yeah, hockey hair, as my wife says, it was false advertising seeing my hairline now. But
Oh my
yeah, I
gosh.
had the flowing locks down to my shoulders and the big mustache and the whole thing. And yeah, hockey has always been known for the flowing locks in
That's
the
amazing.
game. So it was
Well,
part of
and
part of the persona.
that's so good. But to circle back to what you were just talking about there, in the Air Force, we talked about, I was a contract specialist, so we spent government money and we helped support the war fighters with different items. And what we would talk about in the contracting office all the time is that, yeah, you may not be downrange actually, putting bombs on target or lasers on dots or whatever, but what you're doing is you're doing a force multiplier. And so if I go out and get 10 soldiers to dig a trench, you had 10 soldiers with 10 shovels digging a trench. That's what it is. But if you go out as a contracting professional and you purchase a backhoe that can do 100,000 people's worth of work in the same amount of time, then that is a force multiplier. And the analogy I'm pulling from the story you just told is that if you know how to work on a team, and even more so build a team, and then even more so beyond that, lead and develop the team, you're going to be able to force multiply all the way up to, it sounds like, as big of a business as you want to grow and lead.
Yeah. So, how big do you want to be? Big is not everything.
Hmm.
Best is everything to me. Biggest
Yeah.
is not best. Having an amazing company that your employees love working at, your customers. I still have a friend today who I talk to once a month who was the largest contract I ever signed in business. He worked with one of the biggest companies in the world, and he and I still have a relationship. And I remember working to getting their contract, and I was running a $30 million company. I was competing with a 10, 20, 25 billion dollar companies were my competition. And I
Wow.
remember him saying, I took a risk and I bought you and I bought your team because you were the best team. Everybody else talked about being the biggest. You
Yeah.
talked about being the best. And
Yeah.
that's what that company that he left and I left, my company still has a contract in place, 25, 30 years later.
Yeah.
So it's being best is good, but I think what leaders learn over the years also is when you build a team, you don't want everybody to be just like you. You want to create, you talked about having a technology person, because
Yeah.
so hire to your
Jerry, where were you at
weaknesses.
8 years ago, man?
Yeah.
I needed you 8 years ago. Where the hell were you? What happened here, man?
Hire to your weaknesses, not your strengths.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
looking at your team, and I talk in my website as well about doing profiles on yourself and all your other leadership and finding
Mm.
out who you are, like
Yeah.
whether it be there's all kinds. I've got all the different
Yeah.
sites
Disc,
in there that
Myers
you can click
Briggs.
on. Disc,
Yeah.
Meyer-Briggs, they're all
Yeah.
based in psychology. When you find out who you are and what you're good at and really are cognizant of it, it helps you surround yourself with
Yeah.
great people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was a big unlock for me with this business this time around. The first business, we got to that $1 million mark and we had about 25 people. But what I realized at that level was that um, I couldn't replicate myself, and I had hired a bunch of people that were like me, or I had put people in positions that I wanted to be in personally, where it was more of a entrepreneurial type role and a lot of freedom and not a lot of structure, and I knew nothing about building and managing teams. But what is that you get to that million-ish mark and you start having to lead leaders? What is your advice for somebody in that position? And I'm asking selfishly because I'm
Sure.
I'm trying to get back to that level
So
again, and I don't want to make the same mistake again.
I don't tell people what to do. I share my experience. So in hockey, when I was 17, I started playing major junior. I was the best, one of the best in my hometown, let's say, right?
Hmm.
Vancouver, BC. Then I went to the big junior leagues and I was the worst of the best. And I applied myself knowing that. So I went, man, I am really bad. If there's 200 players in this league, I'm number 190 to 200. Over a summer, I went into the top 80. Over the following summer, I went into the top 24 in the world at that time because I was into constant improvement. Where I failed when I went into professional hockey is it I made the major leagues my first year and I thought I'd arrived and I quit doing what got me there. And there's a great book out there
Hmm.
called What Got You Here Won't Get You There by Marshall Goldsmith, best-selling author. He's one of the best, highest paid coaches in the world, charges 30,000 a day. He talks about you've got to keep getting better. And if you're not
Mm.
committed to getting better, how can you expect your people to?
Yeah.
So you've got to sharpen the saw every day. And
It's
if
so
you're not
funny.
doing it, somebody else will.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. This is a little bit of a therapy session now for me. It feels like, because it's like it's funny because like the Air Force, when I was in the Air Force, I got the dream and sort of the bug of starting my own business. And so I started reading books, and I'd wake up early in the morning and get a workout in, and then get some education. And then, I'd really work on my craft. And then when we launched the business, I stopped doing all that stuff. You get
Mhm.
busy in the day to day and you start chasing new things, and you start feeling yourself a little bit because you have a few successes here and there. And I stopped doing the sharpening of the saw that you just described there. And it caught up to us. I mean, eventually I stopped getting new ideas. I didn't have the network around me. I wasn't getting any ideas from books, so I didn't even have like a virtual network. And then all of a sudden you have you have a head full of bad ideas, and none of them are filtered out. And then
Yeah.
you do what I did, which was crash the first business. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing
And,
that. It's a good reminder for
and
me as we launch this
anybody,
next.
as soon as you think you've arrived, you haven't. And as soon as you
Mm,
think you've arrived and you get complacent, somebody's coming to get you. Whether it be
mm,
in sports, business, there's another person out there who's working hard, who's getting better every day. And so my role models in life who lived into their 80s and 90s were voracious readers. They, these days with all the technology we have, I listen to the Wall Street Journal summary every day when I'm walking my 6 miles, because that's the most up-to-date information in the world that I can get. I read business summaries every day. I want to know what's going on in the world, because what I learned from one of my mentors is it's the challenge you don't see coming that gets you. It's the one you don't see coming that's going to get you. So
yeah, that's good. Well, Jerry, I could talk to you for the next 4 hours, man, but I know you're busy, and I'm so honored that you took the last hour to hang out with me and let me go over my barbecue whining stories. Austin, my co-founder, who usually joins me on these things, will be very excited to hear this episode, be like, hey, man, you don't have to talk about this stuff anymore. It's over. Jerry put it to bed for you. It's great.
Yeah.
Before we let you go, tell everybody how we can reach you. I know we got your site. We'll link it up. Anything else we can do to promote you and put you out there?
So just my site is the best way. And if anybody needs to communicate, my site is really just full of tools. It's not selling anything. It's tools that I provide. When I published my book, the editor said, you should have a site, a landing page where you provide free tools to people so they can utilize a lot of this stuff. And so it's nice when somebody comes back, like I work with CEOs, and I'll ask one to start a business plan and call me if they need help. But if they don't start, I'm not going to help them. I'm not going to do it for them. And so when they come back, a month later and say, hey, I've got my business plan done, will you review it for me? That's when it feels good, because I feel like I've contributed in some way. But again, I'm not going to do it for them or make a decision for them. I'll help them along the way.
I love that. Well, I will make sure to link it up, and then everybody can go check that out. I know I've seen it, and it's great. I would highly recommend picking up the book, because like if you're on the YouTube channel, you can see that I read a lot of books. I mean, I've probably read a couple hundred in the last decade, especially in the business personal development space. And this book, you did a really good job. I mean, for what it's worth, from my opinion, but like my recommendation is go buy this book. And the reason is that there's a couple things. There's real world application. There's real world experiences and stories, just like you've done on this podcast. You don't try to play too much in the other person's head and preach at them. You're talking about your real experience and what you can learn from that. And me as an entrepreneur, I got a ton of value out of it, just being able to learn from your experiences and then look at my own unique situation now and go, oh, hey, here's how I can be a better manager, better coach, better leader. And I really appreciate you writing this, because I know writing a book, how many hours did it take for you to put this thing together?
As I said, I've been a note keeper for, 50 years now. So all I had to do, people kept asking me to write it. So it really took me a year to summarize. And by the way, I was living in San Diego, California when I did it. And the first thing I did is hire a coach. She just happened to live in Nashville, and she still does. And she was a former editor of a major national magazine. And she helped me gather and put things into specific units. She edited it. She brought it to final stage, and before I had to take it to a publisher. So it was really a cathartic. It was a great experience, because I'm a horrible writer, and so it was a great experience and discipline for me to cross off the list, because I set that as a goal in 1999 to write a book. And so
what took so long? I know the episode's over, but now I'm curious. 20 years. What happened?
I was lazy. I had it on the list. I had lose weight. I had a second one, and it was write a book. I had those 3 goals there, and I didn't do one of them. And so I crossed the final one off the list. So now I've got to redo the list.
First off, you're not a bad writer, because I've read really bad books, and this one is written really easily consumable. Like, it's not dry, it's very well done. And then you're saying it only took you a year to put together. Well, it's a whole year, which is a long time. But really, what I heard there is 50 years of information and experience condensed down into, I believe, like 250 pages. And in like 8 hours, you can get through this thing and condense somebody's 50 years of experience, and that's why I love books. I mean, I love books more than podcasts or interviews or anything. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing this. I hope people go out and buy it, because it's definitely worth the $20 or whatever it was on Amazon. I loved it.
Thank you so much. That's a nice compliment.
Well, thank you, Jerry. Thanks for joining us on the show. Thank you guys for listening, and we will see you next week.